question we hear a lot is, what is flat? How do I get it? So we're going to be talking about that today. We have a special guest seated over there, Douglas, DMS.
DMS is joining us.
Yeah. I'm usually here, but people don't see me.
Yeah.
So
does that mean you're really here at all, though?
I was going to say he's kind of like behind the camera, but he's actually off to the side of the
camera.
camera.
He lit himself up over there.
He did.
We could see him, but
we got mirrors set up here in the studio.
We got a whole system.
Yeah.
I can't see him.
So this is actually a lot more difficult than it may appear. You would think, just like anything else, well, you draw a horizontal line, that's flat, right? All right, if you were to graph the frequency response of a headphone, you should be able to measure it. It measures horizontal.
Just lay a ruler on it, call it a day.
Right, and that's flat.
Yeah. We should preface this and say that flat is, we're talking about frequency response flat.
What the frequency response flat really is, what it means when something measures flat or sounds flat. And as it turns out, it's very complicated because there's a lot of different ways to define it.
We got to think about, people have to understand that when you're dealing with a microphone or a speaker, you're converting an electrical signal to sound, to a sound wave. So there's a conversion process going on there, right? None of these things that convert electricity to sound or sound to electricity are perfect. None of them. They don't do it the same at all frequencies. And of course, we need to bring up, when we will, that the human ear also is not flat response. It doesn't hear all frequencies the same. So we've got quite a mixed bag of things going on here that obviously real flat doesn't exist. Let's just get that out of the way right now. And I think Douglas can attest to this because he's been in studios.
It gets so complicated because most microphones are going to respond differently. That's your first thing. Then most rooms are going to respond differently, but then you have different standards of what actually flat is. And kind of one of the first accepted standards of flat was free field, which, as you guys know, it's basically if you were to take a speaker and a microphone and have them suspended in space. There's no walls, there's no floor, sound can never bounce back. And in that environment, that's what the original idea of what flat, or the original, most popularly accepted idea of what flat was free field. But that can't exist in reality, Yeah. Doesn't matter where you're listening, there's going to be a wall, there's going to be something that's going to create some sort of reflection. So free field isn't, it's not realistic.
Yeah, the idea of that, another way to put it would be if you're standing in the middle of a field of grass and there is nothing around you, all right, except maybe, say, a pair of speakers somewhere out in the field. That is free field. There's nothing to bounce off of. Even technically speaking, the ground you could bounce off of, but, that's what the grass is for.
That's why you need to be high in the air.
To kind of stop the bounce. But yeah, unless you're, right. In fact, that's what they do. A lot of places have cranes or something that, they don't have a, what do you call it, an anechoic chamber. Yeah. So they'll actually put a speaker up and pull it up on a crane to get rid of the ground from being a reflector, and then make a measurement with a microphone in the middle of air with a speaker hanging in the middle of air. So purely free field type thing.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're really a baller, you could build an anechoic chamber and listen in that. But even then, an anechoic chamber isn't true free field. It's really close to free field. But at that point, it's kind of getting into bouncing frequencies that we can't even hear. But then you get to the next commonly accepted standard, which was diffuse field, which was basically the polar opposite. They're like, well, let's make it as much of a room as you possibly can. And in that scenario, you're talking about a sound where everywhere you are in the room, the perceived loudness is the exact same. You can't tell which direction a sound is coming from. So it doesn't matter where you are in the room or where the speaker is in the room, everything always sounds like it's coming from every direction and is the exact same volume, which also isn't really something that exists in the real world.
Yeah, so... And I mean, that's probably, I think diffuse field would be probably the closest thing to like a headphone experience. That's what you're shooting for, right?
Diffuse field, that's why diffuse field is used for a lot of professional headphones. That's why you see it on the 800s and other things like that. Those things generally aim more towards diffuse field, which technically you can achieve that sort of effect, but it is a curve that people tend to associate with brightness. And there's a couple different types of diffuse field. They're engineered by different researchers. Gross has their own standard of diffuse field. So there isn't even a universally accepted diffuse field standard.
For flat, right? In a professional setting, you're shooting for that, right?
Sometimes.
Right.
Sometimes that's the standard for professional headphones, but it varies. Because in reality, a studio is usually somewhere in between diffuse field and free field. You know, we're talking rooms that are partially treated but still have some level of reflection. There's going to be some level of room gain. It's not going to be perfectly free field or perfectly diffuse field, because neither in a perfect world really exists for speakers in a room.
Theoretical only.
Right. They're both theoretical
Constructs.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
if you're
situations.
making EDM, you're okay then.
EDM?
You could do it like in a computer.
Yeah.
No mics.
Well, that
So-
really raises the question, though, what are you targeting? Because if you're trying to make it sound like you're actually there in front of a live band or a singer, they're probably in a room, right? They're probably not in
Or
the
a
middle of
concert hall or
space.
something, yeah.
Right. So there's probably going to be reflections, and it's very difficult to always make it sound like the actual environment. But I think most people would agree the goal is to make it sound like it did when it was recorded. But there's a little bit of challenges there, because a lot of times there's some artistic license, some flair put into it in the post-processing, and someone
almost
wants to make
always.
it sound different than it did. So now how does it supposed to sound? Is it supposed to sound like the reality, like when it was actually recorded, when this person was singing, or when this instrument was played? Or should it sound like this person that was editing this intended it to sound?
Yeah,
You
which
know?
raises the question of what is really flat.
Right.
Well,
Like,
so let's say in a recording scenario, you've recorded an artist playing in a room. Let's say it was on the binaural head. In that sort of situation, if you're picking up the entire sound of their room, then free field would make sense, because then you don't want to add your room onto their room. But no one really mixes music that way. No one's just completely capturing the room. They're miking instruments. They're trying to capture as much detail and get up close to them, or capture certain parts of the space, or adding reverb, all kinds of things.
and
Which
many times they're trying to eliminate the room too.
Right.
Right. So that kind of makes free field fall apart. So really you end up with something in between, where what they mix is somewhere in between free field and diffuse field, as well as near field miking. And what you have to recreate on the other end is something that is going to either emulate part of that room, or bring back some of the space that they cut out if you're trying to achieve that sort of live sound. And then you get into a really, really kind of messy gray area where there's not really a target curve that adheres to that. So you end up with a few other target curves. Fletcher Munson curves, which I sent you guys a picture of that. I know you guys have seen that before, but the idea there is if you hear any two frequencies at the same time, they sound like they're at the same volume level. So if I played 20 hertz and 1K at the same time, they would sound like they're at the same volume level to the human ear, which is not flat also, because our ears have big dips and peaks that associate with the anatomy of the shape of our ears. So that in itself is already kind of out the window for what's going to sound like real life.
Yeah. So when you think about it, I guess when you talk about what's flat and how to reproduce something, or how to record flat. Let's just start on one end. You're going to record flat, right? And you want to monitor. So you're using monitor speakers, or headphones that are probably EQ'd or similarly somewhat flat in response to listen to what you're recording, so that you can set levels for instruments to flat.
Yep.
Right? Of course, you can measure it. You can see how loud they are at peaks, but they're instruments, they're voices. The levels are varying. So then that's the next question is like, so it's a subjective thing if you think about it, just from the recording standpoint. If someone's got to determine what every mic level is to what they consider to be flat for what they're listening to through, whether it be a headphone or speakers or both.
Yep.
And then what's flat through that? Their ears? What about their ears? Their ears aren't flat, the mics aren't flat, the speakers aren't flat, the headphones aren't flat. So really, when you think about it, flat becomes a fairly,
It's very loosely defined.
it's an abstract.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I
Right?
guess the best example is probably like David Chesky's binaural recordings, where he wants to hear the space in there and everything.
Purposely recorded.
Yeah, yeah.
It goes
It
into
won't-
a church
yeah,
to make
right.
it sound like
Sound
you're in
like
a
a
church.
church,
Yeah,
yeah.
and he's looking for that cool space.
Yeah.
And that's cool. That's a whole different thing.
That's
But
a different thing,
That's
yeah.
awesome, and it does come out quite well.
But how do you make that flat? Because someone took some effort to make it sound a particular way. So you can't just say, well, I want equal loudness across the frequency band, and that's flat to me.
You can EQ it in the mastering process or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
right.
you need to make it sound like this person wanted it to sound. And so really the best guess there is to use the gear they were using because they were tuning it on that gear. They used a set of speakers or headphones or monitors or something to hear this back. And they tuned it to sound good on that. And maybe through their interpretation of what flat is to them, they adapted the output to make it sound like they wanted, to make it seem more likely to be played back
Yeah,
the way
and
they expect.
when you say seam too, that's the other thing too, is when these guys are laying this stuff down, they're in the back of their minds, they're thinking about where it's going to be played. A car setting, headphones,
Yeah.
right? So they're kind of thinking, well, they know who their audience is typically for the music that they're recording, and saying, well, they're also tuning it, knowing to try to make it more popular, right? Obviously you want to sell songs, you want to sell music. That's the whole goal. So you're making sure that it's set up, tuned, sounds good for your particular audience and where you think they're listening to it, or where they're absorbing this music, how they're absorbing it. So there's a lot involved with that subjective flat side from a pro side.
Well, I guess back to David Chesky, at least he knows that you're going to be listening to it on headphones.
Yeah,
so
for the
you
most
got
part,
that
right?
figured out.
In order to appreciate the binaural,
Yeah.
although a lot of people do appreciate it on speakers.
You can do it on speakers,
but
too,
yeah, you're right.
yeah.
The effect is way greater when you've got left-right separation with the headphone and right to your ear, direct coupled. But Douglas has been around studios because he comes from Nashville, so he kind of knows what are they doing over there in terms of a studio to try to achieve flat. What do you
that's
do?
the interesting bit. So there's a couple things there. There were two things I wanted to touch on that. One was the subjectivity of flat, and then the other was the gear. So we talk about the gear that they're using in studios, and what they're using for mixing, mastering, and all that. And you may not always want the same gear they're using in the studio. So first, the subjectivity of flat. That's kind of where you get into the territory of things like Harman, where they went somewhere between free field and diffuse field, and then started asking like random people off the streets, pulling people in and doing studies on how much bass do you like, how much treble do you like, and then sort of added that onto their curve, which ended up being something that the general populace, your average consumer buying Beats at a Best Buy or something would probably like, but ends up not sounding like real life. And that's their subjective take on flat. But then if you move to the gear side for studios, you end up with something totally different, where for mixing, you'll want something that adheres to a target curve. For mixing, you'll want something that falls between free field and diffuse field and is maybe not, quote, air quote, flat, but is pretty linear. But for mastering, it's the exact opposite. For mastering, it doesn't really matter as much about the frequency response because you've already taken care of that in the mix. For mastering, what you should care about is things like your technicalities, detail and dynamics, things like that. So you really end up with gear that falls along multiple different thoughts of design. And in doing so, you have to accommodate for a lot of different scenarios too. So you won't just end up mixing on, say one headphone that is pretty linear, you'll end up mixing on a set of speakers and then another set of speakers and then a cheap set of speakers and then a lot of times that these places have a small speaker setup that kind of emulates the sound of Bluetooth speakers and things like that.
So they're trying to average out what this thing should sound
car
like
systems.
on as many different things as possible that they figure the average consumer is going to be using. Yeah, which is difficult. That's a tough job right
There's
there.
a lot of variables.
Yeah, a lot.
But it effectively means that they're not targeting flat. They're targeting what is more likely to sound flat to the end user, right?
Yeah.
Different
what people are
scenario.
going to perceive as right.
What they're going to enjoy, what they're going to appreciate
Right.
as music, how they're going to appreciate this music. Yeah.
So it's really highly subjective in nature,
Yeah.
and it's open to interpretation
Well,
to some
the
extent.
recording for sure.
Well, go listen to your music library. Listen to 5 songs from 5 different artists. They're almost guaranteed to be from different producers, different studios, different recording methods, and those mixes are all going to sound very, very different.
Oh, sure.
Oh, yeah.
So in almost every studio, I say almost every studio because it isn't every studio, but in almost every big studio, you see a speaker called the Yamaha NS10. And you talk to almost an engineer, and they're like, this is the crappiest speaker you can buy, but we all use it.
Yeah.
And the reason is it's just a universal standard that everyone has heard at some point in mixing, and it sounds bad. And if you can make stuff sound good on that, it sounds good on just about anything. It's just one of those little things that's trickled across the industry.
It's kind of like what we talked about in the past, where if from the recording side, if you take a recording that sounds bad, and you play it through multiple systems and so on, when you get a system that's really, really really good in terms of being neutral and clear and that, and has the proper harmonic structure. Some a really high end like we're used to in the 2-channel side, right? Those shitty songs actually don't sound so bad because the system isn't beating against the faults in the recording. Right? You don't have that system doing the same negatives and I guess that's what they're doing with these Yamaha speakers. It's the reverse. They're creating the music. So if they can make the music sound clear and natural and have the harmonic structure and play it back on a shitty speaker, then it won't sound so bad through a shitty speaker.
Well, it goes one step further.
It's the opposite because it's on the other side of the fence.
Yeah, Abbey Road Studios uses the Bowers & Wilkins Diamond series,
ENW.
which, as I know you guys have heard those are great sounding speakers. A problem that I've heard engineers talk about in interviews from this place, and the reason they have to have other sets of monitors with those is because almost anything they mix will still sound good on those speakers.
Yeah, they're really good speakers.
Right, so
Interesting
you have to
problem.
have other things like the NS10s or these little things that emulate Bluetooth speakers and all that, because if you just record something, play it back on the Diamonds, and that's that, it's like, all right, well, it sounds great on them, it might not sound great on everything else. So things like that are crucial for the mastering stage, but you have to go back and forth and use, crappy things for a lot of your mixing stages. And that's kind of where it comes into the fact that mixing is more of a science, mastering is more of an art.
Yeah.
That's the way I'd put it.
And that pretty much brings that art to us at our end, now on the playback side, or a speaker manufacturer, a headphone manufacturer, right? We're adding our own flair to a wide range of music that we all listen to, trying to make it sound. These are recordings, these are that, right? Their side of it. We're trying to bring out the best attributes of the recorded music, whether it be digital or whatever, mostly digital, on a headphone.
Pretty much the bottom line is everybody's trying to make music sound good, right? So they have different definitions of what that means. A lot of times they may perceive that as being flat, but that's very dynamic. Flat is a very loose concept in this industry because of how everything works, as we described previously, that there really is no absolute reference in the vast majority of cases. There's nothing you could pick out and say, this is how it must be.
Yeah.
Right.
So in fact,
variables.
Well, you
Right.
look at even if you look at all the headphone companies out there, a lot of them have their own definitions of flat. Odyssey's published their own target curve. Sennheiser has their own target curve. Beyerdynamic has their own target curve. We have our own target curve here in house. I mean, you guys have a target that you aim for.
We call it the abyss wave.
Yeah, so you have your own flat.
Yes.
And I know you guys have talked about the details of how you arrived at that target before. But these flats really vary from, each individual research facility and what you're trying to achieve and how you achieve it.
Well, I guess it's the same as on the recording side. Is you're trying to average across a bunch of recorded music to make as much of it sound good as possible, as they are trying to make it sound good on,
Yeah.
as much gear as
Well, that's
possible.
the thing. They're recording everything they're recording is a variable. The way they record it is a variable. Every different microphone is a variable. In fact, the same microphones can be variables too. They don't have to be exactly. They all have different curves to them, even though they're the same model mic.
Well, that's why when you buy like calibrated mics, they all come with
yeah.
a calibration file.
Yeah.
A lot don't. I mean, like this microphone right here, I think this Neumann sounds great. It's not a flat microphone.
Yeah. Right.
All things
Right.
considered.
Well,
Yeah. So so to add to that, you're right. But a lot of Douglas, I guess, mentioned that a lot of studios don't use calibration files for their mics, and they just
They do for their studio monitors usually.
yeah.
And they will try and tune a room to be not necessarily always to a target, but linear, where you don't have just like big dips and peaks really suddenly. So usually when you're tuning a studio, you want to eliminate things like that. But a lot of studios aren't like, okay, this is going to be free field, or okay, this is going to be diffuse field.
Yeah.
They're
Right.
like, okay, there's a weird bump here. Let's kind of pull that down a little bit until things are smoothed out.
And that's why they're choosing those type of mics, is because they do have a character to them.
Mm-hmm.
So they are picking and choosing the mics for particular instruments or even types of voices and stuff, right? So they kind of, again, there's no flat there.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. So I mean, we're not arguing against flat, but what we're saying is, for the most part, is that we see customers that they're trying to make their headphones flat. And they want to
Right.
see a measurement of a headphone.
But there is no flat.
Right, so they can EQ it digitally to make it a straight line. So if say a headphone's down 5 dB at whatever, 4 kilohertz, right? So they're going to take a slider and bump up 5 dB up at 4 kilohertz to try to make the headphone flat.
Well, that makes it harder because then it's like 5 dB down from what?
Right.
What is their measurement rig compensated? It is a raw measurement. Are they compensating it for Harman? Are they compensating it for diffuse field, Gross-Keymar diffuse field? Like, what's it compensated
That's
for?
the
Because
problem.
then,
Yeah, you got to pick.
what are you
something.
EQing it to?
Right.
Yeah.
And all the measurements are different. You could look at one guy's set of measurements versus another on the same headphone, and they're going to look completely different, particularly in that area, that region. So EQing it, I mean, we get that question from customers, like, how should we EQ our headphones? I'm like, well, we don't need to, because we already made them sound the way they sound to play back a majority of music real well.
Right. And on top of that, I mean, AB 1266, with its design, you move it around on your head, you get different sounds. It is a particularly difficult headphone to measure and get, if you're
Sure.
going from one measurement rig to another, you're not just going to throw it on, an IC 603184 and say, this is exactly how 1266 sounds on your head. Because you could move it around, 100 different ways and make it sound 100 different ways.
Sure. Changing the acoustics. The
Right.
driver itself is doing the same thing no matter where you put it on your head, but your ear's picking it up differently. So really, the equalization you use should be for you. How you enjoy listening to what you're listening to. You might want to bump up or drop down levels here and there, right?
Well, I think that's a part people often overlook. You frequently see people, if they're EQing typically to the Harman target. But there's been several of them over the years. They've changed for various reasons, and that's not really neutral or flat. That's people's perception of desirable sound on average. And
even
it's
then,
much more complicated
even
than
then,
that.
like when I look at that and I see those curves, I mean, I understand a lot of research went into it and stuff, but to me, that curve is really only works for the device they were listening to. Like, let's say they were averaging out what people's responses were at wearing a particular headphone. You would get different responses if you put, say, our headphone or another headphone on the same group of people, right? They'd say, well, maybe I don't like the 1 kilohertz range bumped up 3 dB. You know what I mean? And I mean, I averaged over a number of people, and the reason would be because for whatever reason, that other headphone, even though it may measure the same or whatever, might have different reflection points or different resonances within the materials, right? That kind of the ear picks up.
It seems most people have different preferences for what they want and expect to hear out of their sound. You see all the time in cars, if people adjust the tone controls in the cars, people pick totally different set points. Some people crank the bass up, some people put it way down, some people crank the treble, others put it down. So if the point of the master, the mix, is to get it enjoyable to more people, and the point of the Harman target is to make it enjoyable to most people, why are you trying to tune it to somebody other than yourself if you're the one listening to it, right? You should be tuning your gear, your chain to sound desirable to you.
Yeah.
And the thing I find interesting is more often than not, when people are trying to EQ a headphone, they're EQing it to someone else's reference, someone else's target,
Right.
which that's fine. I understand why their motivations are for that. They want to have it try to be uniform. They don't really trust their senses enough to feel reasonable to pick for themselves.
Right.
But that's really beyond the point. That doesn't necessarily mean it's better because it's EQ'd to someone else's curve, because there's much more complexity in the entire chain than this. You should make it sound desirable to you.
Well, that-
And if it doesn't sound better, what's the point?
Right. And not only that, I mean, when you think about it, flat sound doesn't sound good. Really doesn't. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it can.
But what I'm saying is it's a tool, right? It's more of a tool,
Right.
and it's used on the pro side for obvious reasons, But
Yeah.
on the consumer side, it's not really what you're shooting for.
Well,
Well,
that's
even then,
exactly
consumers
the
don't
point.
agree on a lot of things.
Well, yeah.
If you look at how Harman measures and publishes measurements for a lot of their headphones, something will come nothing actually comes dead on a target. I should clarify that. There is no headphone on earth that without software assistance comes within 2 or 3 decibels of like traditional target curves, including the Harman target.
Because you want it to sound good?
If you look at how Harman publishes their headphone measurements, they'll measure a headphone, and then they'll put a percentage next to it. And that percentage is their estimate of how much of the population will like that headphone for the average user. So they'll measure it, and let's say it comes within like 5 decibels of the target, and they'll be like, okay, based on this, 63% of people will like this headphone more than, whatever else, or things like that. But it's interesting, you look at the comments in that thread and people will be like, well, I don't like this headphone at all. You think if 60% of the population likes a headphone, which is still pretty close to their target,
I'm in the 40%.
aren't.
Yeah.
Right. And this is a target designed for the average consumer walking into a Best Buy or a Walmart. That really isn't hitting audiophiles. It's a very, very different target group.
Yeah, it's not what they would shoot for. And, you'd have to say that the word flat would have dual connotations there,
Yeah.
where it measures flat and it sounds flat too, and it's not
Right.
really what you're after. You're after some more flair, excitement,
Well,
I think, in
yeah.
listening to music.
The average consumer looks for a bit more excitement in their music, and even Harman themselves noted in their recent papers that the trained audiophile, the trained ear, looks for a different target than the random person
Yeah.
off the street.
Right.
Yeah, trained listeners tend to opt for less bass than the Harman target, considerably so. They tend to favor things more like mid-range detail and treble and stuff like that.
And I don't know if
And-
you'd use the word trained. It's more experienced, right? We talk
Yeah.
about experience?
Right. Well,
Yeah.
trained or
Experienced
experienced. They
listeners.
say trained listeners.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, more experienced listeners as well.
Right.
And I mean, as you guys know, I have a lot of headphones, right?
Yeah.
I'm like one of those crazy guys that just collects headphones all over the place. And in my collection, I've had a handful of Harman tuned headphones, a handful of diffuse field headphones, and all that. And a lot of them sound good. The Harman tuned headphones, they sound good. But a lot of them are so closely tuned to one another that I never find myself keeping more than one of them. Even like the ones that are like $100 to $1,000, I don't really find myself feeling too much of a desire to collect more things that sound like that, because truth be told, and even from someone who appreciates studio sound and sometimes seeks it, they're a bit boring.
Right.
And that's interesting to say, because that is a bass boosted target curve, or bass boosted compared to other targets.
Yeah.
So it really is super subjective, even on the engineering end.
It's kind of like having all cars painted gray.
Right.
Which one would you choose if you were into
What's
color?
the best color? Yeah. There's pros and cons to each. If you're in a
Yeah.
cold climate, maybe you want a different color than if you're a hot climate.
Yeah.
Depends on your conditions. Depends on what you're looking for. Maybe you want to stand out in the sun. Maybe you want to hide it.
Everyone's got
and
a
there is
different-
without a doubt there's got to be, it makes sense. There's some curve that the average human being will like more. That makes sense. But
beyond
that isn't what audiophiles are after.
Yeah, beyond that, there's more to it.
Yeah.
You
Audiophiles don't want average.
Well, there's certainly a group of people out there that want some really weird stuff. And oftentimes I find they don't seem to know it. They narrow in on stuff that's very unique sounding, and they think it's just the best, and they don't see why other people don't like it. But they fail to recognize that what they're looking for is abnormal. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just fine. But it kind of shows you the subjectivity of it. You could totally like something that nobody else does. It's not an issue.
that's cool.
Yeah, if you want to EQ it to the way your preferences are,
Right.
that's fine. That's flat to you, maybe. That's your ideal preference target curve.
Well, that was kind of the point of 1266, is you could make it sound a bunch of different ways. You could chase whatever experience you were after, ideally.
Yeah, there's a big portion of the design to 1266, right? And we recognized at a very early stage that people have different tastes, different desires, and some people like a lot of bass, some people don't, but it's very hard to have one headphone cover all the bases. And 1266, I think, as a reference, is a lot closer to that than most other headphones on the market.
I got another way to put it, too. I don't know if I've ever brought this up before, but how do you know what I hear?
Well, yeah.
And how do I know what you hear?
Yeah, what color
Or
is
you?
gray, right? How do you know what color orange
Yeah,
is?
right.
What does it look like to you?
Right.
You don't know.
And it boils down to your personal preferences, really. It really
Right.
does in terms of listening to music and how you want to absorb that information.
Yeah. Well, if you look at measurements from in-ear microphones, a few reviewers have started getting into that recently. That shows a lot of variance from person to person just on the shape of the outer ear. And that's not counting how different our eardrums and all that could be.
Yeah, I
and
can
how
imagine.
even then our brain is processing it.
Yeah, the
so we're
variation.
seeing that just
Plus
half the
earwax.
picture is so vastly different from person to person that there is no way that we are hearing the same thing.
Right.
You put on a pair of headphones, I put on a pair of headphones. We are very, very likely to be hearing completely different experiences.
Right.
Well,
So,
that's probably a big portion of why you see so much discrepancy in this.
Sure.
You see so many people saying this headphone's junk, and then someone else say this is the most amazing experience I've ever had.
Sure.
So at the bottom line, it seems to come down to you need to tune it the way you want it to hear. If you think it sounds good, well, then it sounds good, right?
yep.
Well, I know, particularly with 1266, it seems that people start out as like all the adjustments can be like a detriment. They're like, oh, you know, they don't really know how they're going to adjust and everything.
Right.
But then eventually everybody seems to come to the same, oh, I like how I could,
Yeah.
I know what I want for this track.
Yeah, at first they said it sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah.
I just want to slap something
Yeah.
on my head and call it a day. And then you realize what you're working toward.
Yeah.
You're working toward hearing things like you've never heard it before. And then all of a sudden it becomes, the goal is clear and crystal clear. And
Well, you know
know,
what you need to change on a track-by-track basis.
Yeah.
You get used to how you want things to sound, and
Yeah.
you try to equal it out across all different
which
tracks.
is why we have a setup video for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
More experienced video on 1266, 2 videos on 1266 on just wearing it and how to move it about. But really, it's just experimentation. And I mean, like me at home, like, you know, I talked about this and it's crazy, but you could take the headphone and just, the track changes, or you go to another album, right? You listen to a bunch of different mixes things, and I'll just take it like this and just move my head around and shake the 1266 and just get it into place. I don't even touch it anymore. And it's just that simple. It's 2 seconds.
Yeah.
You know, like, okay, I got it.
Well, it's
And-
probably after doing it for 10 years or whatever.
Yeah,
you know,
right. So
it does become second nature.
And most people, it takes a few months to get there, but it's simple at some point. But see, that also shows the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
You know, we're consuming music made by thousands of different people, played by tens of thousands of different instruments and vocals, and you know, and
all different equipment.
we got to somehow
microphones,
at
all
our
that.
end try to figure out how to appreciate that whole big, massive amount of variation.
Yeah. So, circling around to the original question, I think we can all agree that flat is not always ideal. But I think we could probably also agree that what is actually as close to flat as possible just means something that's relatively linear, and that's about it.
Pretty
If
much,
something's
yeah.
flat, it's relatively linear. It doesn't have to adhere to a certain target response, because there is no flat target response, but flat is relative linearity, which may be a good thing, and it may not. It's useful as a tool, but it's not always ideal for listening.
Right.
Well, I guess a good example is, have you ever been in a rental car and you see what the EQ settings are?
Oh, yeah.
It's always bass all the way up.
Yeah.
Every
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, they're a
Pretty
train
much.
wreck.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or it's like, I look at it sometimes and going, did anyone ever even adjust this radio?
Well, yeah.
Because it's like stock. Like even stock settings usually suck pretty hard on
A
a
lot
brand
of
new
cars,
car.
yeah.
They don't set it. They just leave it, I guess, flat or whatever. But yeah, the system's never really proper, it seems, in and of itself, particularly with all the sources you listen to. You just change
Yeah.
from
Well, they do all sound
sat
different,
radio
yeah.
to, you know, the higher end of stuff. Like I think the high-end streamers and stuff, I think actually do some compensating on.
A little bit. I mean, it depends on the people that make it.
I didn't
You know,
wanna
there's
be
a
this part of the
bajillion
video,
different
but-
manufacturers of
Yeah.
audio systems now, and
Yeah, I'm
they
sure they
vary
do it.
wildly in quality.
Yeah, because that's where I was going. Basically, is that some of the, I think there's some manufacturers that actually will set certain EQ parameters or something, even in a vehicle, for the different sources.
sure they
knowing,
do.
Yeah.
knowing that
Yeah.
it's going to be
gonna sound
sound
different.
wrong. Yeah, it's going to
Yeah.
sound bad if you throw
They
too
used to
much.
do that with cassettes.
Yeah, that's true.
And
Right.
it's of course
Well,
you
look
know
at a
the
phono
limitations.
stage.
Yeah.
It's like anything,
That's
right?
literally what a phono stage is.
Yeah. Right.
It's literally, you know, you're pulling up EQ for a lot of the low frequencies on a turntable.
right.
So it's just compensation. You know, there's things like that, the equivalent of a phono stage for headphones. One that I used that was popular in a lot of studios is SonarWorks. They make like software for calibrating your room and all that, your speakers. And they have software for headphones too, but the way they have to do it is they literally measure a crap ton of headphones and then bake in EQ profiles to send out to people. And there's a lot of headphones that they're just like, we can't make a consistent EQ for it. But even then, it's not, they don't make things perfectly flat. All they do is make it kind of linear. You know, you could get an HD800, for example, and, you know, all they're really doing is pulling up the bass and pulling down part of the treble and pulling up part of the mids, and it makes it just less wavy overall, but it's never going to be perfect. But that's the closest thing I could think of to like a phono stage for headphones, something that compensates for various headphones and stuff like that for studio environments anyway.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I've used that software. Yeah, they have like settings, like essentially like presets.
Oh.
Yeah.
So
And some of them are good. I mean,
Per model?
yeah, per
yeah,
model.
yeah.
So you type in what your headphone is, and it'd come up out of a list.
Do they set these things subjectively too, or is it pretty much just by
It's mostly by measurement.
whatever they're looking at for
They
measurements?
have like a rough ballpark they try to stay in as far as a graph is concerned.
right.
But for the most part, it's just if something has big dips or peaks, they just try and correct for that.
I see.
And
Yeah.
leave the rest because they understand there's not a perfect flat either.
Yeah.
But there have been headphones that many people, myself included, and a lot of the community have as a whole not really liked and have flopped that I've tried with the software, and it's done pretty well with them. It's turned them, into something that I would say is usable for studio use, and that can be helpful in some cases. But a lot of the times, if you're really just going that far on something, if you're putting in that level of effort, you can't take that, that EQ profile with you and use it on every portable
Yeah,
device, or translate it to your DAP, or, I want to go for my, my record player now. Well, where's your EQ then?
Well, and the other thing to consider too is not all EQ is the same. There
Yeah.
are some EQ devices that don't do a very good job relative to others. There's a higher end of the EQ, the digital EQing, and there's a low end to it too. So the more EQ you're doing, you get more variation on the overall how it messes with the original signal too.
Yeah. Well, and you generally only EQ a few decibels before you start getting some level of artifacting.
Yeah,
too.
right.
So, and you have to also keep in mind that on top of that, things are being EQ'd and changed during the recording process. So what we're really looking at is it's just a system of stacking changes on top of one another again and
Yeah.
again and again.
Or adding these subtle distortions that there's no way to quantify or measure, but they exist within the recording and the playback chains.
Oh yeah, people freak out about harmonic distortion, but don't realize how much harmonic distortion is added, oftentimes very intentionally, during the recording process. Some of the most expensive and some of the most well-renowned microphones in the entire recording industry add lots of harmonic distortion. And they're running them then off of tube preamps that continue to add harmonic distortion. And then they're, running plugins and EQs and all that to further add harmonic distortion because people find it pleasing. And then it goes out the other end onto a system where it's going, a crap ton of feedback, and my system has a signal to noise ratio of this and harmonic distortion of 0.0001% and blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah. They don't realize they're getting, another 6-7+% of harmonic distortion in the recording.
Yeah, right.
And it sounds good.
It's baked in.
right.
Well, yeah, there's nothing you could do about it.
And you enjoy it too. And you can't add anti-distortion. There's no way to remove that. It doesn't go away. Well, it goes away when you pull the plug.
You're chasing ghosts.
Yeah, right.
That's the thing I find most interesting about this whole debacle, because it seems like the majority of people that are looking for flat don't really understand what that means, and they're seeking a target that effectively makes them think they're listening to how it was supposed to be, but it's much more complicated than that. A lot of times how it was supposed to be was lost long ago, and they tuned it how it is most enjoyable to most listeners. So there really isn't a great way to do that. If you target perfect, or what you consider to be perfectly flat on one headphone, it doesn't mean when you actually play back a recording, it's going to be how it was if you were there.
Right. And you might love that sound. I mean, that might be, if you personally, it might be like, I love the sound of diffuse field. It just takes me places, You might be that guy. And if you are, then awesome.
Right.
But that is going to vary a lot from person to person.
Yeah, it's about as much as we probably
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
can say on the topic.
Clearly, it can go on for another hour.
Could talk for a few hours.
Yeah.
All
Well, we'll
right.
just loop around and bite our own tail. So,
Yeah.
chase our own tail. So
Well, I got to edit this thing, so
Oh, yeah,
I
that's
figure,
true.
yeah, I'm going to go on and wrap this one up if you guys are good with that.
All right, it's a wrap.
So, guys, if you like this video, like it. Send us an email if you have any ideas for a future episode, any questions, totl@abyssheadphones.com, and we'll catch you in the next one.